Hello and welcome to the Ourdadsstamps podcast. My name is Pete West and I've spent half a lifetime collecting stamps and more than 10 years buying and selling them. In these podcasts I want to share some personal stories, tips and tricks that I've learned along the way and maybe encourage a few non-philatelists to take up this fascinating and absorbing hobby. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello and welcome to the first edition of Ourdadsstamps podcast. I thought I'd start off these podcasts just giving a bit of background information about myself and how my love of stamps started. And today we are joined by my wife Sheila, who is going to ask me a few questions. So welcome Sheila.
Thank you very much, Pete. And it's a big honour to be on your very first podcast.
I'm very pleased to have you here. So we start off with how I got involved in stamp collecting. And for me, it was probably a very, very early age because my father was in the Royal Navy in 1958 when I was only 2.5 years old. He went away on a world tour in which he visited 15 different countries. And from each of those countries, he sent me and my brother a postcard. And obviously on these postcards were stamps of that particular country. So when they arrived at home, my mum used to read out the messages from my dad, and I would look at the brightly coloured photos on the front and marvel at the stamps on the back and just wonder what all these countries were like.
So this was a good introduction to you of different countries of the world, because that's where your father had been travelling to in the Navy.
Yes, indeed. It wasn't just about the stamps, because with each postcard, Mum would get out a map of the world and point out exactly where that was. So I was getting a good education at the same time and would find out about different countries and what they were like. And then when my dad came back, which was some 2 years later, he showed me how to steam off the stamps from the back of the postcards. And that formed the start of my very first collection.
So I've heard of people steaming open envelopes, but not of steaming stamps off of envelopes or postcards.
Well, it's steaming the stamps is the same idea. Basically, you want to moisten the glue to make it unsticky, if there is such a word. And lots of people soak the stamps off. But steaming is a safer way of doing it. If you soak the stamps in water, some stamps, particularly the older stamps of Queen Victoria and Edward VII, were printed in what was called fugitive inks, and they were deliberately designed to lose their colour if they were soaked in water. This was a deliberate ploy by the post office because they were really worried that people might soak off stamps and reuse them. And so the idea of a fugitive ink that would highlight this practice was brought about. If you steam them off, they don't spend so much time immersed in water, so they're less likely to leak the colours, and therefore it's a safer method.
So it's just a way then of getting the stamps off of the postcard or the envelope, but preserving the quality of the stamp with the ink and the design.
Exactly so, yes. When you've got a box of 100 or so stamps that all need steaming off, that is an arduous task. And lots of people, me included, soak them in water because it's quicker. However, you do run the danger, as I said, of ruining the stamp. So steaming them off is a better process and certainly is one I would recommend. So, having started my collection at a very young age, I continued to look at stamps and try to grow my collection. My father was an avid collector and we used to get stamps on approval every so often. So when they came around, he would let me choose a few for my collection, and consequently it was added to on a regular basis. Stamps on approval still happens today, which is amazing in the current technological age. but it's basically where a dealer will send a book full of stamps to a customer, each stamp individually priced. The customer looks at the stamps, decides which one he wants, takes that stamp, and then pays for the ones that he has bought and sends the rest back to the dealer. It's completely based on trust. It's marvellous that still carries on today in the current climate, that people could still be trusted to pay for stamps that they have taken.
Now that's a real surprise for me, because I cannot think of any other product. I mean, apart from utilities, we generally pay our water and electric after we've used them, but I cannot think of any other product where you can have that before you pay for it. So as you say, in the world we live in, that there are still an institution, and I guess stamp collecting is an institution, that enables you to do that.
Yeah, as you say, I think that probably is certainly one of the very few things where you get the product before you actually pay for it. And it just shows how trustworthy us stamp collectors are. From that starting point, we then moved to Malta. Malta was the place I was born in, and my dad was stationed there once again in the Navy. And as a family, we moved completely to Malta. I would have been 6 years old, and we lived there for 3 years. And whilst I lived in Malta, I continued to collect stamps. And there was quite a lot of stamp shops, stamp dealers in Valletta. And we used to go on a fairly regular basis into Valletta to go to the dealers and look at these stamps. And again, I was adding to my collection. But because we were in Malta, and because it was my place of birth, I started to collect more and more Maltese stamps. And so from a very early age, I was already specialising in Maltese stamps. By the time we came back to England, I would have been about 9 years old, and I had a reasonably decent collection, certainly big enough at that point to start separating it out. As I said, I was already specialising in Maltese stamps. And so, like my father, I had an album for my British Commonwealth stamps, an album for my rest of the world stamps, but I also had an album specifically for Maltese stamps. And very proudly displayed in the front of my Maltese stamp album was halfpence yellow, which was the first ever Maltese stamp produced. Not hugely valuable, at least the one I had wasn't hugely valuable. It was still pride of my collection because it was the first stamp.
And where did you get that stamp? How did you source it?
Being perfectly honest, I can't remember. I assume I bought it in one of the dealerships in Valletta. Whether my dad bought it for me as a treat or whether I used my pocket money for it, I really cannot remember, but it was and still is a special stamp in my collection.
So you still have that stamp now?
Probably, yes. Probably. I say probably because, as the story will unfold in a minute, the stamp collection went to my dad for a while and then came back to me. So I'm not sure what he did, whether he kept it or not. But I certainly have several halfpenny yellows now. So back in England, rather fortuitously, my mum got a job working in the local post office. She was keen to encourage me and indulge my dad in our love of stamps. So every time there was a new issue of stamps, which at this time, 1965, 66, 67, was becoming more and more regular, every new issue she came home with 2 full sets, one for me, one for my dad, and a first day cover for me and a first day cover for my dad. First day cover is just an envelope or letter that's been posted on the first day that the stamps were issued. And I certainly never paid for any of those, so it must have cost them quite a lot of money, but we had a very big collection in a very short space of time, or certainly I had a very big collection in a short space of time of the new sets of English stamps. And many of those first day covers I still have today. So we've gone from a few stamps on the back of postcards to a 3-album collection in probably the space of 5-6 years. At that age, as a early teenager, I like to think my collection was quite advanced and certainly more than just your normal schoolboy collection. And I remember every 2 or 3 years My dad would buy the Stanley Gibbons Catalogue. It would be the simplified rest of the world catalogue, and we would look through our collections avidly just to see whether the values had gone up, whether they'd gone down, or what had happened. Not that we ever intended to sell anything, or even knew where to sell anything, but we always checked the values.
So, being a person not really au fait with stamping, what does it mean by the simplified?
The simplified album, Stanley Gibbons produces several different catalogues. In those days it was a limited number, but there were several different ones. Now there are hundreds of different catalogues. But the difference is the simplified catalogue just lists the price of the basic stamp, whereas the more technical catalogues, which come under various different names, but they will list things like varieties of watermark, different shades of colour of the stamp, and any other slight variations, some of which have a lot more value than others. So we had just the basic price, and my dad always assumed whatever stamp he had, it was always the cheapest value. If there was two different shades of colour, and we always had difficulty working out the differences in colours, he always assumed he had the cheapest. The only thing we did do to look at slightly specialisms was to check the watermark, because there are several different sets of stamps, particularly the George V stamps, where the watermarks are a completely different set, and so both those were listed. And we used the age-old method of lighter fuel, cigarette lighter fuel, to moisten the stamp, which the watermark would then show through. Nowadays, of course, that's not a great idea in terms of health, in terms of safety, but also in terms of looking after your stamps. And there's lots of proprietary methods of finding the watermark. But back in the 60s, lighter fuel was pretty accepted by a lot of people.
So you also mentioned that the gold standard is the Stanley Gibbons catalogue to finding out about the stamps, finding the value of stamps. I didn't know until the other day Stanley Gibbons was a real person. Yes,
indeed. He is like the godfather of stamp collecting, really. Stanley Gibbons, funnily enough, was born the year that the first stamp was issued, the penny black, in 1840. And he recognised from a very early age that people would collect these postage labels, as they were called, or postage stamps. And by the age of 15, he was selling stamps in his father's chemist shop. His father allowed him his own stall inside the chemist shop, and he was making a reasonable living from selling stamps. Within a few years, he had set up his own business completely as a dealer of stamps. And the first ever Stanley Gibbons catalogue was produced in 1865. And the catalogue is basically a sales catalogue. And there is a misconception amongst some people when they buy the Stanley Gibbons, or any other catalogue for that matter, in that it gives you the value of the stamp. That's not strictly true. It gives you an idea of what the stamp is worth, but it's actually a price list. The list in the Stanley Gibbons catalogue is the price you would have to pay Stanley Gibbons to buy that particular stamp. You can't just look at the catalogue and say, oh, I've got one of those, it's worth £400. If you were selling a car, you wouldn't expect to sell it for the same price as a Ford dealer would sell the same car. So you wouldn't expect to sell your stamp for the same price that Stanley Gibbons is selling the stamp. And that's before you get on to differences in condition and everything else. So yeah, a catalogue is a very useful tool, and certainly every stamp collector and every stamp dealer uses one. But as to the value of your stamp, you need to look at more things than just the catalogue.
So you mentioned there that Stanley Gibbons created the first stamp. Did you say created?
No, he didn't create the first stamp. He was born when the first stamp was
right,
printed.
So he was born. What was the purpose of postage stamps then? So presumably people were communicating via some kind of letter system. How and why did the stamp get invented for that purpose?
Well, up to this time, although there was a royal post, it was farmed out to various odd concessions. and charges were very expensive based on the distance that was travelled by the letter. Also, it was paid for by the receiver, which was very time consuming for the postman to collect, and sometimes meant the receiver either refused to pay or didn't have enough money to pay. So the whole system was quite inefficient. This led to calls for reform, and in 1835, a man called Rowland Hill issued a paper proposing a lower charge which would be uniform throughout the whole of the UK. He also proposed that these charges could be prepaid by the sender and so speed up the whole process. Initially, the charge was set at 4p, but by January 1840, this was reduced to a penny per half ounce. And in turn, this led to the production of the penny black as proof of prepayment. And on the 6th of May, the first penny black was issued. Within a very short space of time, just a few years, the rest of the world saw that this was a good idea and adopted the same system.
So with the very first penny stamp then, regardless of the distance that letter was going, it was 1 penny?
Yes, there were two values actually. Again, most people think of the penny black. There was actually a tuppenny blue issued at the same time, and although the penny black was printed first, both stamps, the penny black and the tuppenny blue, were issued simultaneously on the 6th of May.
So I imagine in the very early days of using a stamp, people would write the letter on one piece of paper, but that piece of paper would be folded almost to make its own envelope. You didn't have the paper and the envelope. It was one piece of paper creatively folded into the envelope.
Absolutely, yeah. Obviously envelopes weren't needed in those days, so the paper was folded up in such a way to resemble what is now an envelope, and usually sealed with a wax seal so that nobody else could read the letter until the person it was intended to. So by the time I was 12, 13, I had a pretty decent stamp collection. I was getting regular new issues from my mum still working at the post office, and this continued up until I went to university at age 18. I still kept up a healthy interest in stamps. Maybe didn't spend as much time as I did when I was younger, because as a teenager you have other interests, but we were still getting, as a family, we were still getting stamps on approval, which would add to my collection. As I said, my mum was bringing in some stamps every time there was a new issue. And also in the post office where she worked, the postmaster had a little cabinet of stamps that he used to sell. Whether these were his own stamps or whether they were somebody else's he was selling on their behalf, I'm not quite sure. But there was a steady influx of stamps on display with various odd prices. And quite often I would spend my pocket money or my newspaper round money on new stamps added to my collection. And then I got to 18, went off to university, and I said to my dad, I'm going to university and I really won't have time to do anything with these, and it's probably not safe to take my collection with me. I'll leave them with you and I'll come back for them at some point. Little was I to know that some point would be quite a few years later. And that story we will continue next week when we pick up my resurrection of my love of stamps. Thank you for listening to my podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it and maybe you've learnt a little too. I would love to hear from you with your tips and stories. I can be found on Facebook and Instagram as Ourdadsstamps, as well as through my online shops at eBay and Delcamp. Listen again next week for another episode of the Ourdadsstamps podcast.